So this is the first presentation of the text, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and in this video I'll be speaking about preface of the text, and this is preface A. In the edition that I have, it has two prefaces. One is preface A and the other is preface B, which is preface to the second edition. Today I'll be talking about preface to first edition, and both these prefaces to the Critique of Pure Reason are extremely dense, and very important formulations are presented in these two prefaces of what the text is about, the aim that the author has. And for anyone who is trying to read Immanuel Kant, I think this is a very good starting point, even though some might think that it is very cryptic. The formulations are axiomatically presented, it's very settled, but still you could see that Kant is trying to uh, set up the principles of his inquiry, and hence the principles are very clearly laid out. So in one sense, if you read the preface, it can be a very good entry point into Kant's thought in general. So I decided that I'll speak about preface to the first edition, which is a shorter preface compared to the second one, which is of 21 pages, and this is around 9 pages, but these 9 pages are very well written. Now, just a brief word on why Immanuel Kant. So, I'm speaking about Immanuel Kant because Kant's work relates to uh, what I've been thinking about, the work that I've been doing on in philosophy of mathematics, in anthropology of mathematics. So, I'm coming from that direction, and I believe that 20th century mathematics, whether you think of people like Frege or Hilbert or Russell and so on, was heavily influenced by the Kantian framework. Although I would not say much about it because I intend these videos for anyone interested in Kant, but I just wanted to clarify that that is the direction that I'm coming from. And also, apart from the foundational issues in the philosophy of mathematics that I'm deeply interested in, I'm also deeply interested in the methodological foundations of sociology. And again, for that as well, whether it is Weber's work or it is Durkheim's work, you can see Kantian and neo-Kantian influences at work in their writings, and also the way in which we have received the thought of Karl Marx, the way in which we read Marx, the way in which he has been sociologized, depends on Kant's thinking. So, the promise of modernist mathematical thought or modernist sociological thought and the limitations of these two are both depend, I think, on their Kantian heritage. So, one has to develop a critique of what Kant says, an understanding of what Kant says, in order to arrive at some understanding of what is going on in early mathematical thought in the 20th century, and also in the sociological thought. So that's the direction that I'm coming from, but none of that will influence my presentation of the text. It will be a simple commentary on the way in which the text is structured, and I'll be focusing on the text itself, and I'll not be making any interpretation of what Kant says, except adding a point here and there, but the primary aim is to summarize. So the edition that I am speaking from is The Critique of Pure Reason, translated by Norman Kemp Smith, which is perhaps the most well-known translation of Kant's book, and I'll be speaking from that. So let's start with the first preface, which I've already said is of 9 pages and is, uh, I think it's quite well written, because Kant quite clearly lays out the ambition of his project and what he's trying to do, and it's nice to begin with that, because It's a nice entry point into the text, a text which is so extensive, so exhaustive, so dense, and so long that you need some sort of sort of an entry point in it, and Kant himself provides that. So I would suggest that those who are coming to the text for the first time, they can start with the preface, and the first preface in particular. So I'll start with a quote from this text, which is the opening line, the opening sentence of Preface A, and I quote, Kant says, human reason has this peculiar fate that in one species of its knowledge, it is burdened by questions which, as prescribed by the very nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore, but which, as transcending all its powers, it is also not able to answer. End quote. So Kant is saying that which species of knowledge he's talking about. He's saying that when it comes to for reason to inquire in its own on about its own foundations, when the task for reason is to inquire what reason is, what is the legitimate field of its inquiry is, then it is burdened by questions that it itself is unable to answer. Because hitherto, what people have been saying or thinking about reason was not at all reflective. And what Kant is trying to do, he's trying to suggest that in order to come out of this impasse, to grow out of it, this bind, reason and the enterprise of inquiring into reason should become more reflective, should become more reflective of its presuppositions about its field of inquiry, about its legitimacy, and so on. So he says, so far that has not been the case. In fact, he adds later on the same page that reason so far has been compelled to ask questions which itself it cannot answer. And he says this arises because of the sheer power of reason. The sheer power of reason is such that it transcends any kind of empirical employment, and it has a free sort of a free application, and because of which Kant says reason oversteps its bounds, and one doesn't have any means to judge whether the application of reason is right or wrong. So, precisely because reason is free, precisely because reason doesn't have any inherent limits, or thought doesn't have any inherent limits, one can apply thought or reason to any kind of possibility, any kind of range it can have. But precisely because of that, one doesn't know whether whether one is employing reason in a legitimate way, whether what one is doing with reason is legitimate or not. So reason in a sense oversteps, transcends all legitimate empirical employment, and may lead to paradoxes and inconsistencies because of that. So he says that that's why to develop, to organize an empirical test for reason is very important. Without that empirical test, reason becomes void, reason becomes empty. It may seem as very powerful, it may seem as extremely powerful, extremely extensive. It may have a freewheeling application. One can speculate about any concept, one can speculate beyond experience, and so on. But Kant says it is precisely because of that tendency that reason runs into all kinds of problems, all kinds of paradoxes and inconsistencies, and illegitimate formulations. And Kant is trying to establish reason on a firm foundation so that one can precisely sift out what is legitimate and illegitimate employment of reason. He says this battlefield on what reason is, speculative range of reason, this battlefield constituted by the legitimate applications and illegitimate applications of reason. This field of controversies regarding reason is metaphysics. And Kant is trying to secure the provenance of metaphysics, because he says that metaphysics has had a very bad name recently, because uh, otherwise he thinks it's a queen of all sciences, but metaphysics, which has to do with reason and the faculty of reason, has of late has had a very bad name, because it has become devoid of any kind of content. People are arguing past each other. People are saying all kinds of things about what reason is, what reason can be, and so on. And Kant says, because of which metaphysics lacks rigor. But he says, if it can be resurrected, if it can be founded through an analysis of what legitimately what reason is, then one can secure once for all what metaphysics is. And it's interesting. The preface is interesting for the kind of metaphors that Kant uses. And it's very important to see that Kant thinks of his exercise as a legal exercise. He thinks of metaphysics, uh, the the purpose of resurrecting, the purpose of cleansing metaphysics as essentially a legal exercise. And he thinks that that what he thinks critique of pure reason is. He calls it, in fact, the critique of pure reason as a tribunal. So it's very interesting that what the Kantian strain in philosophy is essentially uh, very similar to a legal strain, because he's trying to sift out what is legitimate, what is illegitimate. So it's sort of a policing philosophy that Kant has. So he says, as already mentioned, that metaphysics has lately had it didn't have a great reputation. Its reputation has gone down, and even attempts by people like Locke, who have tried to provide a physiological understanding of how human understanding and reason works. These projects haven't succeeded, and because of which we are in a state of indifferentism regarding metaphysics. People have left metaphysical questions and queries behind, and they think that all there is to do is to engage in positive sciences, and they are satisfied with what they get with positive sciences. They are not really interested in metaphysics, but he thinks precisely because of that, metaphysical questions are important, because unknowingly people use metaphysical assumptions even while doing sciences, and it's best for us as critical theorists, and he thinks this is the age of criticism. So it's very important, he believes, for us to understand these metaphysical assumptions, and if possible to rectify them, to articulate their principles, and so on. So in fact, there's a pressing urgency which is articulated in preface, the first preface, and he says there is an urgent call for reason to undertake self-knowledge and to establish the provenance of its legitimate application. So with Kant, you can say that reason becomes self-reflective. If reason before Kant was a tool, a very important tool, a very important device to speculate about things as wide ranging as nature, matter, mind, God, soul, and all kinds of phenomena, now Kant is saying that let's pause and let's think about the principles of reason itself, and let's think about its legitimate provenance, where it can be applied, how it can be applied. So and he says there's an urgency to do it, because we have run into so many contradictions that the very field of metaphysics has become devoid of any content or purpose. And it's, as mentioned before, it's quite interesting that Kant resorts to the language of law to do it, and calls the critique of pure reason a tribunal. Now, uh, what is the aim of the critique of pure reason? What is the ambition that Kant sets himself to achieve? And in his own words, and I quote, the critique of pure reason is the critique of the faculty, quote, the critique of the faculty of reason in general, in respect of all knowledge after which it may strive independently of all experience, end quote. Another quote where the ambition or aim of the critique of pure reason is expressed, quote, the subject of the present inquiry is the question how much we can hope to achieve by reason when all the material and assistant of experience is taken away, end quote. So he is actually inquiring into the principles of pure reason without the assistance of experience, without the assistance, any external material assistance, and he is trying to ascertain what are the principles of pure reason. The objective of this is to understand reason in its legitimate employment. So he says, further adds that his purpose is to legally sift the legitimate from the illegitimate application of reason. And he says this purpose is addressed by philosophy. So, philosophy in the hands of Kant has a clearly defined purpose, and that purpose is to clearly specify, delimit the field of metaphysics, delimit the scope of reason, and whatever uh, doesn't stand scrutiny of the philosophical enterprise must be abandoned, howsoever prized it may seem. So what Kant is doing is quite interesting, because there are echoes of Kant when you read people like Wittgenstein as well, because this is that the tone is quite similar, at least as far as this preface is concerned, because Wittgenstein in his first book, The Tractatus, is also trying to uh, see what is legitimate, what is illegitimate application of thought and language and so on. So it's quite interesting, this Kantian heritage, how it is continued by thinkers after Kant. So he's, to reiterate, he's looking at the legitimate as against the illegitimate applications of reason, and to delineate the features or principles of pure reason. Now, his aim, as he says, he singles out as his aim the the idea of completeness, which means that he claims to address and eventually solve all metaphysical problems. Now, this is a very ambitious claim. So he thinks that once this book is once he undertakes this project, then all the metaphysical problems will be solved, all the metaphysical problems will be addressed. Again, you can see that later Wittgenstein had the same aim in the Tractatus, when he thought that all philosophical problems are addressed and solved by his book. Similarly, here Kant thinks that all metaphysical problems are solved by his book, and he thinks so because the principles of pure reason are few in number, and metaphysics is a closed science. So once you have isolated these principles and they have been reduced to few in number, then uh, all the problems of metaphysics can be clearly specified and hence solved. So he has a twofold aim, and these are related ideas. One is completeness. Completeness means to address each question completely, and exhaustiveness, to address all questions completely. So this is the specified objective of the critique of pure reason. And he thinks the form of inquiry, he says the form of his inquiry is comprised of two aspects. One is certainty and the other is clearness. Um he says, as far as certainty is concerned, he doesn't have a place for opinions in his system. Now, since his purpose is the determination of the principles of all pure a priori knowledge, he says because of that, there is no place for opinions in his system. What he is offering are apodictic principles, certain principles. So, certainty is a very important aim. In that regard, he clarifies that this attempt is predominantly to explore the faculty of understanding and to determine the rules and limits of his employment. He says that this he carries out most extensively in the second chapter of the Transcendental Analytic, a part of this book. This inquiry into understanding, he further adds, has two sides. One refers to objects of pure understanding and is intended to expound and render intelligible the objective validity of its a priori concepts. This is in Kant's own words. And the other is concerned with pure understanding, its possibilities, and the cognitive faculties upon which it rests, and so deals with it with in its subjective aspect. So there are two sides to what Kant is doing. One is to inquire into pure understanding and to render intelligible the objective validity of its a priori concepts. And the other is the concern with pure understanding, understanding in itself, not in its application, in its itself, in its possibilities, and that is the subjective aspect of it. Now, Kant says that his thesis, his book, is mainly about the first part, that is uh, pure understanding, and is intended to expound and render intelligible the objective validity of its a priori concept. So he's basically concerned with the idea of validity of the a priori concepts of understanding. So when it comes to validity, so he has important things to say about experience, about intuition, when are concepts valid, what is the legitimate field of their application, and so on. So that is the part that he's interested in. So experience, sense, perception, all of that is very important for Kant. However, as far as pure understanding and its pure possibilities and its subjective aspect is concerned, he says he is not so certain about those aspects, and he offers a set of hypotheses regarding the same. So he is when he says that his form of inquiry is certainty, he is primarily interested in the first aspect of understanding. Uh, so he says, and he must be judged on its basis rather than on the basis of the hypothesis he draws about the latter part. As regards the second form of inquiry, which is clearness, he says that he claims to have provided discursive clarity through concepts, but he himself says that he has not strived for intuitive clarity through examples, as this would have unduly extended the work. So, just to reiterate, he aims to provide completion to metaphysics and says that only didactic issues will remain after this work, which means that metaphysics will come to a close, and further metaphysical issues will not arise after this work, and only didactic issues will remain. So he is extremely ambitious, extremely confident about what he is doing in his text. And to reiterate his aim, he is asking the question, and I quote, "What and how much can understanding and reason know apart from all experience?" End quote. So the purpose that Kant has in this text is to inquire into the principles of pure reason, and what reason and understanding can know apart from experience. But as you will see in the second part, in the preface, the second preface, he will talk more about experience, more about how the concepts of understanding relate to experience and representations of objects that we experience. But I'll not go into that now. But you can see that it's a very ambitious plan, and it's an ambitious plan. At the same time, it's also a modest plan, because unlike people like Leibniz and so on, he has a very modest aim, and that aim is that he thinks that reason has an inherent I would not like to use the word limitation, but an inherent capacity for legitimate and illegitimate employment. And he says, if we are not very conscious of that, we ask questions which reason cannot legitimately answer. So, unlike Leibniz, so one cannot speculate about each and everything. So what he's trying to do is trying to understand the principles of pure reason and the provenance of its application. And this he thinks is very important in the age when he was writing, with so many scientific developments and so many uh, things happening in chemistry and physics and so on, that he thought that it's very important to secure, to make metaphysics more scientific as well. So it's a work which is quite representative of its age and times. So that is what Kant is doing. It's a very ambitious text. It's and it's quite interesting for the kind of metaphors that Kant is using. And metaphors are mostly drawn from law. So he sets up, so critique of pure reason he calls as a tribunal, and he, for him, philosophy becomes sort of a legislative exercise. So it's quite interesting that his purpose is to sift out what is legitimate, what is illegitimate. So you can see that it's unlike for you know so the primary orientation is uh, not to give imagination a free rein, you know, but to see whatever we have, to scan the field, to gaze the field, scan it, to organize, classify, to establish. So it's essentially it essentially it has a foundational aim, critique of pure reason. And foundational aim, I do not mean in an ontological sense. Foundational aim in an epistemological sense. So what is Kant founding here? Kant is founding here a kind of method, a method for say metaphysics. And this methodologism of Kant, I think, became really important in the early 20th century for mathematical thought and also for sociological thought, particularly in the writings of Durkheim and Weber. So it's just to reiterate, in this opening of the preface, Kant is trying to establish the aim of the critique of pure reason. Although I would say that in order to understand fully what he's trying to do, one must read the second preface as well, because here there are he says things, but those things may be misleading as well. So he's basically interested in the principles of pure reason, how concepts of pure reason apply in understanding to the outer world, to the world of experience, to the world of representations. And he's trying to purge metaphysics of false assumptions, of contradictions and paradoxes, and to clarify the principles of reason. And he thinks of himself as uh, as uh, as a legislator, so to speak, who sets up a tribunal to judge, to um, to legislate about metaphysics, and that is the essential purpose. So this is preface A, and in the next video, hopefully after some time, I'll be speaking about preface B, which is a longer preface, and it's much more dense than this one, where Kant speaks about his aims in greater detail. Uh, Thank you.